So we can officially welcome you this evening to the Centro Pro Unione for another one of our lecture series that we are co-sponsoring with the Russell Berry Foundation. And we're most happy to have with us in our midst a dear friend, Menachem, and most of you know who he is because he has been teaching you. And certainly if you haven't been one of his students, you know his writings. So we're very pleased to have him this evening, and he's going to speak maybe in a different area than usually. He's going to speak about interreligious dialogue, namely, what is the task of theology? What are the theological foundations for interreligious dialogue from a Jewish perspective? So without further ado, we want to welcome Menachem LORBERBAUM to our center and to give us this lecture this evening.
Okay, good evening, everybody. It's truly both an honor and a pleasure to be here yet again, and to speak, and also to be teaching in this wonderful program over so many years. I want to begin by expressing concern, and deep concern. We have two of our students are from the Ukraine, and the world is in a dark moment. In the course itself, I'm at the Angelicum. I'm teaching a course on the biblical theology of the political theology of the Bible, and it seems that seems to be just a timely topic. Perhaps, unfortunately, it's always a timely topic. So what I'd like to consider today is to speak about the foundations of an interfaith dialogue, the theological foundations for an interfaith dialogue. The way I conceive of it, and I think it begins with noting two important points with regard to our two important preliminary points that we should think of. The first is that it seems to me that any theology must be comparative. And why do I say that? Because usually the way revelation works in our different religions, in our respective religions, especially the Western religions of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, is that it seems prima facie that revelation empowers a private religious language, and I think that this is an erroneous point, that we should be thinking about revelation that way, and I'll soon say more about that. But let me first begin by the first point, which is to argue that theology must be comparative. Now, why is theology comparative? Why must it be comparative? Because insofar as we understand theology as the means we have to reflect upon our religiosity, what does it mean for human beings to encounter the divine, we are necessarily speaking from our understanding as human beings of what it means to be in the world. We approached God from the world. And our initial approaching of God from the world is a point that we share with all human beings in our epoch. All human beings have the same kind of conception of what it is, a world, more or less. And in that respect, encountering God is a limiting notion on our very experiencing of the world. But we begin with the world, and we begin with a shared world. So on this level, our perspective on the divine is always from the world and from a shared world. Moreover, I think that even after being blessed with revelation, we return to assume responsibility of this shared world. So the world is the world of human beings. As the Psalm says, the heavens, Hashamayim Shamayim Lashem, the heavens are unto God, ve'aretz natan livnei adam, but the world, the land, he has given to human beings. And so I think that this is a point that we always have to remember. In this respect, we share, human beings of a given epoch share much more between each other in terms of the perspective from which they approach God than often they share with their ancestors. Think about people growing up in a biblical world that imagines the universe as being a flat Earth with a round-shaped heaven sitting upon it, which is the ancient picture of cosmology that you would have in Mesopotamia, in Egypt, in pre-Socratic Greece, and in ancient Israel. I think one of the amazing things to see is how quickly that picture is left behind as soon as a Ptolemaic universe becomes the shared picture of the world we live in. But think, for us, what a Ptolemaic universe looks like, we who no longer live in a geocentric conception of the universe. So our notion of God as and the divine as a limiting notion of our experience of the world, but also the very fact that we approach God from within a world, we approach God from a shared world of human beings. And I think it's for that reason that that we never escape our humanity in that, and that creates the basis for, first of all, for shared discussion, for shared concern, and for shared responsibility. So this is, I think, a crucial level on which we might treat all theology as necessarily beginning from a crucial comparative element within it. But the second element is that we expect our religious language, not always our theology, because insofar as theology is reflective, it can help us explicate our religious language, but it can't take its place. Insofar as our religious language is expressive of and articulates human beings' encounter with the divine, it's here that we seek for a language that captures an intimacy. But intimacy shouldn't be, I think, confused with having a private language. Those are two completely different things. And here I would follow that position in 20th century philosophy, thinking mostly about Wittgenstein in his philosophical investigations, who argued that there is no such thing as a private language, That doesn't mean that we're not individuals and that we don't know what intimacy is, or that we seek to articulate intimacy, but that we cannot identify our deepest feelings without putting them into words that are necessarily public. We are born into a language that we didn't create. And I think that one of the things that theology or revelation seeks to give us is a way of challenging the fact that we must use a language that we are born into, but that we want to try to open ourselves and our linguistic abilities to new ranges of experience, to be able to ask crucial questions about the way we are. So for these reasons, I see the task of theology is a very complex one. It's one that seeks to help us reflect and articulate. It's one that seeks to guide us, but one that also, I think, should inspire us with a certain kind of humbleness with regard to what it is that we can expect from our religious language and what a revelation can give us, what kind of directive it can give us. I think I would argue that human self-transcendence is not an escape from humanity, but an empowering of a spiritually oriented humanity, which is something very different. And insofar as we think of a theological ethic in that way, I think we are also don't have to feel that we have to negate the humanity within us. So let me try to now put it in a slightly different way, and that is that if we think about the Enlightenment distinction between universality and particularity, which I think is a bad distinction. But if we think in terms of that distinction, we can say that what we share universally is that we are particular creatures. That is, that we come from specific languages, from specific cultures that articulate a shared human experience. So it's a very complex. It's our linguistic situation is already complex, and I think this is foundational because if you think about about what is the structure of Genesis 1, 2, and 3, I think we see something very, very interesting, and this will lead us to another step. Genesis 1 is a unique cosmogenic story. It's built on the structure of ancient mythology, but it's also dramatically different. It's dramatically different in two important respects. One respect is that whereas ancient mythologies are focused on theogony, on how did the gods come about, Genesis 1 begins with the question of how is it that the world came about? So it's already a very, very different perspective. Second, in contrast to most creation stories, even in the Bible, if we look at the creation stories that we find, for example, in Psalms 104, or in the book of Job. In the book of Job, we have three different discussions of cosmogony. All of them are characterized by what has been called an agonic conception of creation. That is, creation is a function of a struggle between God and chaotic powers, where God comes out victorious, and along with that, a world. Now, this might be hinted in the second verse of the Torah, in the second verse of of Genesis 1, and the land was chaos, and there was darkness upon the deep. But I think what's so striking about Genesis 1 is that this is the closest you come to that. It's not the dominating theme, and it's not even clear what kind of signaling it is that this verse is trying to do to that tradition. Instead of a focus on struggle and or as John Day's book on Genesis 1 is called God's battle with the dragon, instead of focusing on that, Genesis 1 gives us or portrays the divine creation as a creation in language. God speaks. God speaks. And this is a creative word. God says, "Let there be light." Yehi o, vayhi o, and there was light. And at least one way of reading this verse is that it's the very calling into being that is light in verse 3. Now, but this is a God that operates in language. God speaks. Now, why is this the mythic form of Genesis 1? Why is Genesis 1 adopting this kind of structure and this thematic to understand creation? I think the way to approach this question is by asking, what is the function of Genesis 1? Assuming that a major task of mythic discourse is legitimation of a certain structures of culture and of meaning, we can see Genesis 1 as focusing on an amazing issue, and that is the week of human beings, the 7-day week. The 7-day week is a product of culture. It is not cosmological. It's not like the morning and the evening. It's not like the lunar year. It's not like the solar year. It's a division of time that we, as human beings, live. And what is being legitimated in Genesis 1 is this as a structure of human production and creation. You see this on the Sabbath day. On the Sabbath day, we are called to refrain from production, from all production processes, from labor. What does this teach us? It also teaches us that the realm in which human beings realize the sacred is in the realm of culture. The claim of the sacred in Genesis 1 is not metaphysical, and it's not theurgic, and it's not magical. It's about how we acknowledge the divine in the world of human culture and meaning. How does God become an operating force in creating meaningful lives? To the degree that this is indeed the case, I think my reflections upon language before become all the more important. And let me add to this another issue. What does it mean that God creates in language? I think that Genesis 1 has its companion chapters in chapter 2 and 3. In what sense? In chapter 2, Adam calls all animals by names. And as the Torah says, as the book of Genesis says, Kol asher yikra lo ha'adam hu shemo. Whatever it is that the Adam will call him by name, it will be its name. That is, it validates the human taxonomy and joins it. But it joins it on a deeper level. It joins it by looking at human linguistic abilities as reflecting the divine creation in language. God creates by speaking, and human beings confer meaning by speaking. This is, I take to be fundamental to Genesis 1 and 2. And what this means is, I think it also explains to us something very important about the project of mythos as a genre, and why it is that biblical theology doesn't want to give up easily on this genre. One of the reasons that we are constantly challenged by mythic discourse is because we are all products of Aristotle's conception of science. In what sense? If you look at the Aristotelian corpus, you see that it is basically divided between those works that are focused on logoi, on words and language, and those works that are focused on ousia, on being, or on physis, or on life. That's a sharp distinction within the Aristotelian corpus. When you think that way, you don't understand what mythological texts are doing, because they seem to conflate language and causality. But I think that if, instead of trying to understand mythic discourse in terms of the science that comes after it, but try to think before these structures, then we can see that the project is not only how to describe how a world comes into being, but how a meaningful world comes into being. The crucial issue is meaning. It's a meaningful world. This is what the mythic discourse is about. And I think it's for this reason that the biblical authors in Genesis 1 adopt it. They adopt it with a picture that's very different from the one that we often see in ancient mythological texts, and actually suggest an alternative. As I said, this alternative, first of all, is characterized by the fact that it's not theogenic, but cosmogenic. And secondly, we can clearly say of Genesis 1, which may not be the picture in the entire Bible, but in Genesis 1, God constitutes the order of the cosmos. Cosmos also means order in Greek, but he is not of the order. Okay, that relationship is a very interesting one, unique to Genesis 1. It's something that you don't find in ancient mythology, and I think that one that in many ways keeps our thinking for all the religions who are heir to this picture. Now, having said all this, I think also another point, which I won't develop now, but that the creative moment in Genesis 1 on the divine level finds its counterpart in the human world in human reproduction. The great moment of human reproduction, I think, is the one that comes up at the beginning of chapter 4, when Adam and Eve give birth to Cain and Abel. And the verse says that Adam begat in his image. Vayoled ha'adam b'tzalmo. I think that this is a great moment of marvel in the biblical story, because no one could have known that this is what would happen. That is, that the fact that human beings are in the image of God is bequeathed from parents to their children. This is new. And it's an eye-opener. It's a revelatory moment. I won't deal with that aspect, which I think is fascinating. But when you take all this into account and you see the relation between Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 and 3, you see that the way these chapters are structured are by putting in place the notion of human beings being created in God's image. Human beings reflect the divine as a creator of a meaningful world in which there is a place for human and divine encounter. This is the foundational notion of human beings being created in the image of God, as I understand Genesis 1 and 2 and 3. But what does that also mean? That means that we find here the theological foundation for the biblical notion of covenant. A covenant is the meeting between and the agreement between God and human beings. What's so interesting about the covenant? What's interesting about the covenant is that God does not take his authority as self-evident. Divine authority with regard to human beings is worked out through a mutual agreement. This doesn't mean that human beings and God are symmetric. They're not. But it is a meeting of moral equals, which is something very, very different. That is, you can make a claim and a binding that obligates them both. And I think the foundation for this is worked out already in the very structure of Genesis 1, 2, and 3. Moreover, it's not only about what it means to be in the world as standing before God. It also inspires us and demands of us dialogue as foundation to who we are. The covenant is working out of a dialogical structure. And the foundation for the dialogical structure is put into place in the creation story. Because what it means is that both human beings and God, as operating in the human world, operate within language. And why is the dialogue so important? And here I'm getting to the heart of our issue. What is it that we can expect and should we expect from an interfaith dialogue? I don't think that the calling of an interfaith encounter is a Unitarian form of religiosity. I think that a Unitarian form of religiosity is expressive of what I would take to be a questionable form of universalism. We have our particular languages, we have our particular identities, we have our particular encounters. I don't believe that we are called to overcome them. But I think dialogue gives us something completely different and something that I would argue is more radical. Because I don't believe that meeting with others is a call for alienating our particularity. Because particularity is inescapable. What can we do, though? We never see, any one of us never sees the place from which we are speaking. We always speak from a place that we assume, but we cannot see. What does a real dialogue give us? A dialogue gives us a friend, a comrade, who can reflect to us the place we're speaking from. A real encounter between two different people is not only the claim of otherness that we suddenly encounter that sometimes shatters us, but the fact that when we have someone that we can really speak to, we learn a tremendous amount of our prior assumptions of the place we speak from that we could never see. We don't have that perspective. And I want to tell you that I find, I look at the years that I've been in Rome, and I think about these years. I think about meaningful encounters. And I think that for me, as a Jewish scholar of Torah, one of the greatest experiences here has been that my Catholic students have shared with me their understanding of what does it mean to encounter God as a Catholic. I would have never known that. I look at it and I'm wowed. I say, wow, it's so different in the world I come from, but amazing. And I remember walking on the eve of the Day of Atonement of Yom Kippur in Jerusalem in the afternoon, and I was supposed to lead the services in my congregation. And as I was walking, I was joined by a Palestinian Muslim worker who had just closed the business and on the main drag, and he was walking towards the old city, and we were walking together, and I said to him, listen, you have 30 days of Ramadan, and that's a serious fast. We've got one day a year and we cry. And I said to him, listen, I'm supposed to lead the prayer now. I want you to give me advice. Tell me, how does it look from your perspective? And he said to me, well, you must first pray for the world. When you approach God, you have to pray for the world. Wow. I thanked him. I went on my way and he went on his way. And I carried this dialogue between us for a long time. Then a couple of years later, I was in the old city also on Yom Kippur, and I went up to before the last prayer of the day, I went up, which is really the highlight of the day. I walked up to, in the alley where the synagogue where we were praying was, it was also the Kabbalist yeshiva Bet El, which is an old yeshiva of Kabbalists from the from the first half of the 19th century. And I walked up, and they were just beginning, just before the final prayer of the day, and the head of the yeshiva stood in the front. His head was covered with his prayer shawl, and he turned to his congregation of very learned mystics and said to them, my colleagues, I remind you that we are not here today to pray about ourselves. We are here to pray for the universe. And I remembered my talk with the Palestinian years before on Emek Rephaim in Jerusalem also, and say, oh, here are people that are calibrated with the world, that this is something worthwhile thinking about. So what I'm saying is that, first of all, on a very important and practical level, is that I don't think that there is such a thing as a universal point of view that is not within a particular language and culture. But what I do think there is, and is our responsibility, is to understand the limitations of the place we are speaking from. I think that there is a biblical word for it. It's a biblical word that's not used in Hebrew anymore in this sense, but it is in the Bible. If you remember in the story of Jacob on his way to his uncle Laban, and he leaves Beersheba, and he reaches a certain place in the evening, and he falls asleep there, and then he sees the vision of the ladder. Now, the Hebrew is that when he arrives at the place where he falls asleep, the Hebrew is vayifga b'makom vayalen sham. Now, vayifga b'makom, that means he hit upon the place. And this verb of hitting upon the place, I take to be the verb in Genesis that's being used for an encounter. And it's a shocking encounter because Jacob doesn't realize where he is, and it's only when he awakens that he says, oh, I can't believe I fell asleep, and this is where I was. But I think that's so true to the human condition in the following sense, that most of us are aware of the enormity of the moment only in hindsight. Very few of us are so calibrated in the world to be aware of what's happening in real time. So this is an important lesson. Now, what does Revelation give us? What does Revelation give us? What is the alternative understanding of Revelation according to what I said now? Because according to my line of thought, our real problems are not the problems of truth and error. It's not the truth value of this or that faith position, but the fact that we mostly are caught up in the prisons of our own languages and discourses and cultures. And how do we break out of them? And I think the important thing about a revelation is, first and foremost, that for me, the revelatory moment is to be evaluated by whether it causes us to look differently at the world. Do we see things differently? After this encounter, are we the same or not? And my teacher of blessed memory, David Hartman, used to say that at the theophany at Sinai, God put on the greatest show on earth. And the next morning, the people of Israel made the golden calf. Didn't touch them. And then slowly God realizes that changing people necessitates a long process. It's not the big show. It's how do you cause them to think differently? What will be a transformative moment in the way we perceive our lives around us? Now, having said all this, I think we still have to ask not questions only of method, but also questions of content. So I also want to speak a bit about content. And I want to speak about the kind of biblical calling that at least inspires me, and share this with you, because I think that one of the issues that we're deeply perturbed by is up to modernity, we all lived in religious communities in which our religious institutions determined the horizons of our lives. And the deep secularization of modernity means that our religious institutions no longer determine the horizons of our lives. They're just another undertaking. Religion is like economics. It's the state that determines relevant horizons. That's the meaning of modernity. It's a big price to have paid for, to live in a world in which the horizons of our daily life is not determined by the sacred or by institutions of the sacred. But it's also can be treated as a great opportunity, as an opportunity for assuming responsibility in our social lives that is inspired by our commitments and our faith commitments, but without having to drag God into the fight for authority. So it's also an opportunity. But what do we call on? What tools do we have? What implements do we have? What within our traditions that can help us and guide us within this? And for me, a crucial chapter is actually Isaiah 11. It's a chapter I like very much. I think we all know it, but I'll read it out just that we get a sense of it in English. Then a branch will grow from the stock of Jesse, and a shoot will spring from his roots. On him the Spirit of the Lord will rest, a spirit of wisdom and understanding, a spirit of counsel and power, a spirit of knowledge and fear of the Lord. And in the fear of the Lord will be his delight. He will not judge by outward appearances or decide a case on hearsay, but with justice he will judge the poor and defend the humble in the land with equity. Like a rod his verdict will strike the ruthless, and with his word he will slay the wicked. He will wear the belt of justice, and truth will be his girdle. Then the wolf will live with the lamb, and the leopard lie down with the kid. The calf and the young lion will feed together, with a little child to tend them. The cow and the bear will be friends, and their young will lie down together, and the lion will eat straw like cattle. Bless you. The infant will play over the cobra's hole, and the young child dance over the viper's nest. There will be neither hurt nor harm in all my holy mountain, for the land will be filled with the knowledge of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. This is, I think that there's not a month that passes that I don't roll these verses over in my mind. I think one of the good things of growing up the way I did was that that the Bible is chanted with melodious structure in the Jewish tradition. So I basically sing it out to myself many times as I'm walking, because it's such a powerful verse. What's so interesting about this? When you ask yourself, what is Isaiah bothered by? What's bothering Isaiah in this chapter? And I think that the focus of Isaiah 11 is actually not on injustice. Isaiah is not complaining about injustice. That's not where the forte is. I think Isaiah 11 is the first text, I think, in human history that is perturbed by violence. The issue is violence. How is it possible to overcome violence in human life? I think this is what Isaiah is troubled with. And Isaiah understands, amazingly, that the only way that we can hope for a different horizon of existence is if we can imagine a world in which justice is not dependent upon violence. That's the connection between the two parts of Isaiah 11. Because if you look at what the Messianic King does, he imparts justice by words, not by shedding blood, not by using force. And this raises an interesting question. I was hoping I'd have more time to talk about it, but I won't this time. And Maimonides interprets this chapter in two different places in his works. In his Code of Law, in the Mishneh Torah, in the final two chapters of the book, this is a 14-volume codification of law. The final two chapters deal with the Messianic King, and he states there, he reads the first verses about the Messianic King and his success as a condition for achieving knowledge of God. That is, he argues that a successful Messianic kingdom, a successful polity, is the polity that makes itself unnecessary. That is, that would create the kind of affluence that will enable human beings to live in a way that they are not on the brink of survival. So that's a very political notion of messianism. But in the Guide of the Perplexed, when he analyzes this chapter, he looks at it differently. In the Guide of the Perplexed, he argues that the reason for violence losing its edge and hold upon human beings is because the entire world is affected by the knowledge of God. Knowledge of God is redemptive. It's transformative. And I think that in our lives, within the world, we are, at least I find myself moving between these two models. On the one hand is being a responsible citizen, is being active in my polity, trying to make a difference. On the other hand is an understanding that what we can do with affecting the material and institutional circumstances of justice is always limited. In order to bring people to heal the violence within them, this is something that only knowledge of God can do. And that's where we come in as teachers, as pastors, as priests, as rabbis. We try to make a difference in people's lives. We try to make them look differently at the world. Try to open our eyes to see the need, to see suffering, and to assume the responsibility to alleviate it. That's the place, I think, where we can bring the touch of revelation into the world. So.
Menachem, thank you so much for leading us on a spiral, I think, based on certain principles to the heart of your conclusion this evening. Thank you so much for that. We have some time for questions of clarification or even challenge. So maybe about 10 or 15 minutes. Raise your hand and I'll bring the microphone to you.
Thanks for that. I suppose I'll ask why you said that you find it amazing how Catholics encounter God. What is amazing about it? What's different? What's notable? Tell us.
Are you Catholic?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. What I have to say is not about, I'm not speaking about Catholicism. I'm speaking about what people have shared with me. And it's interesting. Look, I'm a native New Yorker. I live in Jerusalem. I actually live in Kerem. I think I wrote Jim that I sometimes walk around the hills of Western Judea thinking about John the Baptist and all kinds of other apocalyptic Jews roaming around these mountains, trying to keep away from the theological political seduction of my hometown. So it's complex. But growing up in New York, I remember as a child seeing nuns in habits and being kind of scared. I didn't know what it meant. It's funny that that's the original thinking. Who knows what archetypes are operating? And then I started coming here to Rome to teach, and one of the students took me a couple of times around the different churches of Rome for the first times I was here. And slowly I think I developed the confidence to ask my students how they understand themselves, what is important, what strikes them. And I heard from a number of students spoke to me about what they called the mystery. And I was really amazed by that, because I don't know any Jew or Protestant or Muslim who would answer that. And then sometimes I ask people to explicate a bit more, speak a bit more about if the discussion was right. But the very fact, that articulation that I heard from a few people, I found deeply impressive and moving. It's not the religious range in which I operate. I grew up on different things, but it's one that I could definitely understand. I'll tell you why. I'll tell you why it struck me, I think, also, and why perhaps I was even ready for it in certain ways, was because I think the book that really changed my life when I was a yeshiva student for many years, and when I was must have been 21 or 22, I read William James's Variety of Religious Experiences, and that shook me. And because I suddenly realized that there's no reason for me to doubt these beautiful articulations that people described of religious experiences that are much better articulations than what I could have given. And that made me, in the language I would have used then, it made me a committed pluralist. I suddenly realized that I need a completely different account and understanding of what encountering God means. I've never been a secular person that's not it's not me. I have many atheists in my family, and we make for good arguments, but it's not me. That's not where I live. I can't imagine being in the world without encountering God, but that doesn't mean that the world becomes meaningful. It means that we're in a very complex form of being, but I hope I've answered your question somehow.
While we discuss about mystery, I have a question actually. At some point you said, you were saying, you were talking about being a responsible citizen trying to make a difference, right? And you talked about violence. And I think you helped us walking through your theological understanding. But my question would be, considering the situation the world is living, what we feel, what we see, the news, how would you live that in practice? Because I hear from where you come. Right now, my question would be where you go.
Well, that's a good question. Throughout my mature life, I've asked myself where I can make a difference. And I've tried to get to assume positions in which the outcome has a maximum reach. So, for example, let me give you a career possibility. I'm a vice dean for appointments in the humanities at Tel Aviv University. That means I have responsibility for the advancement of about 120 of my colleagues, and really engage in many ways in career counseling. That's really an important part of it. Now, I've been asked twice to be the Dean of Humanities, and I've twice declined. I don't think there's anybody in the Israeli academia who said twice no to this. And not because I don't think I can do the job. I know what it entails. I don't think that the effect that I can have on the well-being of my colleagues would be the same. That's, for example, in a career way, but what I've done now is now I'm a member of the board of the New Israel Fund. We give out millions of dollars to try to strengthen civil society in Israel. And what that means is that you take responsibility for affecting change along a whole range of institutions, that you yourself are not dealing with this one particular or that one, but you're constantly asking how we move this map forward. How do we make this difference? So this is how I've tried to live. I've always asked myself where I can step in a manner that's now. It also, many times you're called for particular actions. For example, when the COVID began, we suddenly realized that there are entire families that have no way of supporting themselves during holiday seasons. So we created my wife and I, collections using just our WhatsApp. Sent to everybody I knew, a collection for Passover 2 years ago, and then 4 months later for Ramadan, because we realized that many families don't have the money to buy dinner after the fast day. Now, and in each one, it's a very complex one. Sometimes you have Muslim organizations that don't want to say that they've received money from Jewish families in a contested area. Sometimes you have ultra-Orthodox Jewish families who don't want suddenly to say that secular Jews have been completely open-hearted and open-handed to give them. So you have to negotiate all this. But what I'm saying is that the opportunities are there. The opportunities are there all the time to make a difference. And you have to decide where is it that, I think each one of us has to decide where. The Hebrew saying is wonderful. The rabbis say that the criteria is, what is a mitzvah that cannot be done by someone else? This is what I constantly ask myself. What is the good deed that if I won't do it, no one else will do it? So that's my criteria. Has that been helpful? Okay.
Thank you for the exposition this evening. When theology investigates the truth, it does not operate like philosophy. Theology always investigates the truth from two presuppositions: God and revelation. These are always presuppositions for a theologian. When a Jew reads the Hebrew Bible, he reads the Hebrew Bible as the Hebrew Bible, independent of the New Testament. When a Catholic Christian reads the whole of the Bible, he reads the New Testament in the light of the Old Testament. He understands the New Testament in the light of the Old Testament. My question now is, what do you think should be the alternative understanding of revelation, given these two traditions?
I think, Humphrey, from what I said, you see that that I don't share a certain assumption in your question. So I'm not sure that I'm the good person to ask your question. And what's the assumption I don't share is that our articulations of faith are structured like propositions that are measured by truth value. I think about faith as a posturing in the world, the way we conceive of meaning. And looking at it from that perspective, I can tell you about the experience of encountering the New Testament as a Jew. I remember very clearly the first time I read the New Testament. As a young person, I must have been about 23 years old. And necessarily, it's a very, very different perspective. When you come from years of studying Talmud to encounter Jesus and Paul, what you encounter as a Jew is someone who's people who are asking fundamental questions on the assumption of the Bet Midrash, on the whole of study. And I've always found that an amazing experience, and really enlightening one. But it's a very different way from the way a Christian reads these texts. It's dramatically different. And I think that I would not properly comprehend the meaning of the New Testament as a new point of departure had I not encountered so many Christian students and friends that have shown me what it means to live in a different faith community, what the church is, what the church as a Corpus Christi is, which is something you would never be able to imagine if you were just reading the New Testament, especially reading the New Testament coming from my perspective. So I think I'm not very helpful on the heart of your question, but what I can do is sketch an alternative approach, and that alternative approach is one that I think is meaningful, or at least very meaningful for many Jewish readers of the New Testament. I'll also add to it another thing, is that on another level, again, the questions, as I said, insofar as the theological enterprise begins from a shared world, you can understand why, at least for me, people like Rudolf Bultmann, like Karl Barth, have been crucial theologians. Looking at them reflect on the meaning of their Christianity has tremendous impact on how I reflect on my own Jewishness. So it's I think that this is I treat it that way. I look at it this way, the way I've just suggested. I hope that was helpful.
Okay, we'll take one last question.
Sure.
Thank you very much for this talk this evening. I have a lot of questions buried here. I'll take the simple one. So early in your talk, you spoke about the agonic conception of creation that you don't see as a dominant theme running through Scripture, from Genesis 1, chapter 1, verse 2. And thus it sort of surprised me when near the end you came back to Isaiah 11, speaking about the prophet's preoccupation with violence, and you obviously have a deep affection for this text. It's a formative text. I wondered what is the difference between the preoccupation with violence or the agonic conception of creation, and I don't know. It strikes me that this Isaiah text is so important for you, when earlier I thought I had heard you push back on that idea as a preemptive strike, if I can use that.
What's your name? Jason. Jason, thank you for that question. No, it's at the heart of the matter. I think that the idea that Genesis 1 is deeply connected to apocalyptic writings is on the mark, and I think that the transposition of agonic creation mythological themes to apocalyptic thinking is a marker of biblical thinking, and in the case of Genesis 1, I think there's a good case to be made for the notion of a divine light in the first chapter as being connected to exactly two apocalyptic texts, like in Zechariah, like in Daniel, like in later Isaiah. But with regard to the actual theology that I want to espouse, I'm closer to Maimonides' attempt to somehow tone down apocalyptic eschatology as a framework for reflecting on religion, and to think more about politics, law, and justice, and move in that direction. But that's about the most I can say. This is stuff I'm thinking about a lot, and I think you saw the seams in what I saw, and this is in what I said, and this is sort of kind of what I'm trying to figure out. Sometimes the best account we can give for foundational biblical texts are not necessarily the kind of theology we may want to espouse. It's complex. It's a good question. This is what I'm meditating on. Thanks. Appreciate it.
We'll conclude. There were some people who were online. There's a comment and a question. So Let me read the comment first from Charles Cohen. It is a comment on the weakness of our faiths in the real world. That the speaker that means that you first encountered the New Testament when you were 23 years old. I imagine that the experience of Catholics with Jewish texts beyond the Old Testament is probably similar. We need to start learning about each other from a much earlier age. So that's the comment. Now the question from Bernadette. What does the expression secular Jew actually mean? Surely each Christian person in their engagement with the world and social issues is morally and ethically informed by their religion and culture?
Well, this turns to a complexity which usually when I thank Bernadette for the question, and what I can say is that over the years teaching here, I've kind of understood what are certain points that I have to clarify mostly to my Catholic students in order to understand where I'm speaking from, and that it's a very different place. And one of the quizzical points for all my Christian and Muslim students is to encounter this notion that Judaism is a religion of a people. That's something very foreign to both Christianity and to Islam. And the fact that it's a religion of a people means, at least, it gives one of the possibilities, and it's a central possibility in modernity, that peoplehood precedes religion. And that means in modernity that most of the Jewish people have nothing to do with Jewish religion. But what that means for me as assuming the calling of teaching Torah is how to engage my fellow Jews who are elsewhere, those that don't come to synagogue, those that have not entered the Bet Midrash. How do I do that? Teaching at Tel Aviv University has been a wonderful chance because this is the hub of secular Israel. I give a course yearly on the Guide of the Perplexed, an introduction to the Guide of the Perplexed. I get 30 students, none of whom has ever opened the book or ever thought about it. And it's always fascinating to see what their intuitions are. I kind of usually open the discussion by asking them, who here believes that God has a body? No one does. I said, okay, you're good products of Maimonides without even knowing it. So these are the kind of things that always go on. Yes, it's a completely different challenge. It's a very, very different challenge. I think that this is part of that theological political structure of Judaism that's so amazing, because one way you can go is to go in the way of ultra-Orthodoxy, and that is to create enclosed communities and decide that you're the real Israel. The other way is to say, no, you've got a responsibility for an entire community. If your community has no idea about who God is, that means you're not doing your job. That's a different way of going about it. And maybe I should end with that, with part of what's driving me with that is something I heard from a dear friend that many of you have known, his works, of Christopher Stendhal of blessed memory, who I once was walking down with him the steps in the Hartman Institute. He was beside being a professor at Harvard, he was also an Archbishop of Norway. And I asked him a certain question about how he manages a certain issue in his congregation. And he says to me, Menachem, I'm not in management. That's a good statement. God bless you.
Thank you so much for dealing with the questions that were put, that were challenging, and also causing us to rethink our own stance. And I think that is something important. And so many of us look forward to carrying on this dialogue with you in your home in Jerusalem. So thank you once again.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
You're welcome. And we wish all of you a very good evening, and keep in our prayers our brothers and sisters in very challenged places with the serious threat of war and violence. And have a blessed evening, and to you, Menachem, a holy Sabbath.